So I guess that new Magnus thing dropped. Gonna be honest, I've been way out of the loop on this whole thing. I first binged the Magnus Archives back while Season 5 was airing and managed to catch up in time to watch the last 15 or so episodes as they were released. After that, I spent a while on the fringes of the community until I was eventually pulled away by various other interests. I did see that they announced a Kickstarter for a follow-up series of some kind, but that was slated for release in 2050, and so pretty much completely slipped my mind not long after. I only learned that the first 2 episodes I dropped when I saw them in my subfeed. Briefly for those not in the know, the Magnus Archives is a podcast distributed by Rusty Quill and written by Jonathan Sims, who also both voices and shares a name with the main protagonist. Initially framing itself as a horror anthology, it centers around the Magnus Institute, a research organization focused on the paranormal. Every episode features the Institute's archivist, the aforementioned Jonathan Sims, reading out a first-hand account of a paranormal experience submitted to the Institute, along with some additional information he and his team were able to dig up. As time goes on, certain recurring names, locations, and broad thematic concepts begin to paint a picture of the world the story takes place in, and more time is dedicated to where John and those around him fall within it. While I won't be talking in too many specifics about the predecessor show in this video, I'm not necessarily trying to avoid spoilers either, so if that sounds at all interesting, please go listen to it. As of right now, 3 episodes of the Magnus Protocol have been released. Okay, so, the day after I finished writing this, script, episode 4 dropped. In this video, I'm going to review those, as well as talk more generally about my first impressions of the podcast. Once we're caught up, I'm hoping to review new episodes as they come out, or at least a small few at a time. The content dropped on my channel has gone on long enough for me to be considered a V-tweeter by most reasonable standards, so with any luck I can get a rhythm going here. Also, I know having random gameplay footage on in the background while talking about whatever is a style of video several years out of date, but I sincerely have no clue what I'm meant to do for visuals, so you'll be seeing me do my FF14 roulettes. Or you can just tab over, I guess. Sorry for the bad gameplay, these were literally the first few times I ever took Reaper into group content. As just about anyone could have predicted, we have a new setting. The Office of Incident Assessment and Response, or OIAR, is a government-affiliated group which, much like their apparently quite flammable predecessors, catalog various accounts of supernatural encounters. This time by way of a system that scrapes them from various places around the internet, including some we probably shouldn't have access to, all while running on hardware that probably shouldn't be able to support it. Occasionally, the system will very stubbornly insist on reading one of these out loud in the voice of either Jonathan Sims or Alexander J. Newell, the voice actors of previous series star couple Jonathan Sims and Martin Blackwood. There's apparently one other voice, and given both context and the announced voice cast, it's not hard to parse out who that could be. Of immediate note is that the level of banter has been upped, especially compared to the first season of Archives. I imagine that for most, the greater focus on character interaction right out the gate will be a plus. In my case, I'm less sure. While I always liked the characters well enough and was certainly invested in the central mysteries of the plot and world, my main draw has always been the statements. It's the environment where Johnny's writing is at its most consistently strong. While I definitely don't think we're getting there yet, I can't help but be a bit worried about the weird place they could end up tonally if they're constantly surrounded on both sides by office comedy moments. So how about those characters then? Well, it's hard to form much of an opinion on them after just 3 episodes, but at the moment I'm not completely sold. Sam is our protagonist, maybe? I'd call him the audience surrogate, but most of the audience is going to have so much more information, or at least so many more presumptions than him, that it's not sure it'd be quite right. Either way, he has all the qualities of one. He's new to the OIR, a bit naive, and interested in digging deeper into what's going on. He's likable enough, I'm rooting for him. It would be neat to learn more about his history with the Magnus Institute, but I can't claim to be all that invested. Part of it could be that Chaham Hamza's performance is a bit stilted at times, something that could easily be smoothed out once he's had more time with the role. Moving on, I am not a fan of Alice so far. She does a lot of quipping, which is a problem when you're rarely funny. So far, the attempts to show a little more depth in her have not succeeded in getting me more invested, and the fanbase's speculations of deeper hidden motives haven't been all that convincing. Gwen seems a little one-note at the moment, but the glimpses we've gotten into her motivation, to say nothing of her last name, are enough to get me paying attention. Finally, there's Colin, who's pretty solid so far. His dialogue is generally well written, he's managed to make me chuckle a few times, and his position as the IT guy means he'll more than likely be at the center of revelations about the system. As I said before, however, the characters are cool and all, but they're not what I'm primarily here for. Including the first of the 2 in episode 1, we've gotten 4 ghost stories so far. Previously we called these statements, I'm not really sure if we have a term now. I'll briefly give my thoughts on each. If you're watching this because you're unsure about listening to the Magnus Protocol, then my verdict in short is that they're broadly pretty good and you should go hear them for yourself. The first of 2 unnamed stories in episode 1 is presented as an email. and seemingly tells the story of its writer encountering something inhabiting the corpse of their deceased partner. I'm not sure who wrote this one. Alex and Johnny are both credited as writers, so I assume they each read their own contribution. Overall, it's fine, and the imagery surrounding the reanimated Arthur is strong. A great deal is left ambiguous, however, and while that's obviously fine, it's very clear in this case that it was an issue of time constraints. We don't learn much about their partner, which could have made it more horrific hearing about his body being defiled and maimed. We learn essentially nothing about the consultant figure in the story, which is the kind of exposition that archives love to hide strange and sinister details in. That all said, it does serve its purpose in the narrative, to the point where it's kind of difficult to say to what degree these can be called flaws. The second story seems to bolster my hypothesis about who wrote what. Narrative voice has always been one of Johnny's strengths, and the convincing impression of a hobbyist for him here makes me think it was his work. First off, I want to say that as someone who went completely blind, not seeing any promotional material or looking into anything ARG related until after listening to these 3 episodes, hearing Magnus Institute Ruins was one hell of a hook. The story itself is primarily about the aftermath of one user's exploration of said ruins. I really like how this one uses its format, particularly how we can't see the image posted by Red Canary's account and have to try and picture it through the reactions of other users. If I had to nitpick though, the way that the forum mod treats it as just another infraction rather than a massive escalation does read a bit strangely. Episode 2 features Making Adjustments by Alexander J. Newell, in which a woman gets a tattoo and shortly after feels driven to alter her body in various ways to be more perfect. These include modifications that don't exactly seem possible for a human, definitely not one working with whatever they had in their apartment. There's a lot to like about this one, but let's start with an issue I have. I understand what the story is about. Everything thematically works together, but on every other level there's a sort of disconnect between what happens to her and what it actually does to her. Initially I thought this might be set up, and that this tattoo artist character's work will eventually be revealed to have a wide variety of effects. But that would kind of break the thematic coherence I talked about. The whole influencer thing they've got going on was definitely a part of that. I do think that the abstract nature of the supernatural threat here was somewhat intentional, however, and for the rest of the story, it's actually a strength. It seems like it actively wants to daze you a bit, so you don't immediately notice the change when she begins to actually alter herself physically. That along with the ending, which implies either that she was jumping back and forth from describing herself in her portrait that whole time, or that the two have some direct effect on one another. It's a great closing line, up there with the best stingers of Archives. Episode 3's Putting Down Roots was written by Protocol's first guest writer, Graham Patrick. The presence of guest writers was one of the few things I actually remember from all the way back during the Kickstarter announcement, and it honestly made me a bit nervous. Even if they all ended up doing a good job, so much of my love for the original was directly tied to how Johnny approaches horror. Still, Graham does make a pretty good case for himself and his fellow outsiders. At a quick glance, he seems to primarily be a Call of Cthulhu DM. I don't know, I'm not really into TTRPG podcasting. The story takes a journal format and follows a man on the run from the law for something, the nature of which becomes clear as events progress. He arrives in some kind of city garden, I believe, which proceeds to transform him. I hated this one, I mean that as a compliment. It's probably presumptuous to call this a corruption statement, but it hits all of those notes perfectly while remaining appreciably different from how Johnny tends to handle them. Great stuff, exactly as skin-crawling as it needed to be. So yeah, it's been pretty solid so far. Episodes 2 and 3 both give the impression that we're putting a bit more emphasis on the psychological this time around, a prospect which I'm basically neutral on. That said, I do have some concerns about these stories when taken as a group. In his foreword to episode 1, Alex said this is the best place to start for Magnus as a whole, both Archives and Protocol. Yet while these are good, I don't know if they make for a good introduction. They're all relatively abstract and at points deliberately difficult to follow. When one looks at the first 3 episodes of the Magnus Archives, they're all very accessible short spooks. Do Not Open isn't all that cohesive, but its narrative is easy enough to follow. Episodes 5, 6, arguably 7, 9, and 10 are all similarly easy to get into. I understand that Protocol probably needed to establish the Institute ruins from episode 1, but I think it might have been better to follow that up with relatively traditional stories if they really wanted to bring new people in. Before I give my final thoughts, here's some other stuff I wanted to mention. I've heard a couple times now that some people have issues with the audio or can't always hear what the characters are saying. I never had that problem, and I almost always have my attention somehow split while listening, so I don't know. I briefly took a look into the fan theories that have already popped up, which was a much needed reminder not to do that. The idea that we're dealing with desires instead of fears this time around is one I don't find completely ridiculous, but nevertheless firmly disagree with. Each and every one of these has involved fear of some kind. The being in the first story seemed to actively parody the prospective character's desires, not fulfill them in an abstract, overly severe, incomplete way as one could feasibly argue with episodes 2 and 3. The question of whether or not the system of fears is carried over, however, is a whole other matter. While not everything so far can be easily mapped onto it, that was always the case, and nothing seems to really cause problems for it either. On a meta level, I can imagine the people at Rusty Quill being worried about it getting old, but one of the many things I've always loved about the world building of Magnus was how it never really could. There are a vast multitude of stories still to tell about the powers and their influence on the world. Personally, I hope we're keeping to the original 14, but it's also possible that RQ wanted to be able to do those big reveals about the nature of the world again. Almost as interesting as hearing about the Magnus Institute burning down in the 90s was learning that it existed at all in this universe. For those who don't remember certain things from Archive, that raises a few questions all its own. I mean, it could still be what we're all thinking, particularly given what we know about the relationship of fear at a time, but that it's still specifically the Magnus Institute makes it seem like it runs somewhat deeper. Overall, I'm not quite as gripped by the Magnus Protocol as I was on my first listen to the Magnus Archives. Part of that might be expectations and adjusting to change, but I think some of my problems with the characters and overall structure do contribute. Isn't to say I'm not invested. The mysteries of the computer and its 3 voices, the Magnus Institute, what exactly it even was this time around, I want to learn more about all of it. Plus, if they can maintain the quality established by episode 3, I'm eager to see how other writers tackle some of these well-trodden motifs. I'm definitely going to be continuing, and hopefully continuing to do these reviews, so subscribe if you want to keep up with that, or if you're interested in other stuff I do, like music reviews.